The sun was beginning its descent over Sacramento, painting the horizon with streaks of gold and amber. Eric Porter, still dressed in his workday suit, was driving home after a long day at the office. His sedan hummed steadily, the air conditioning, whispering cool relief against the lingering heat, while the faint sound of the radio softened the pressure of city life. As he approached an intersection, he eased into a slow roll at the yellow light, braking just as it turned red. That's when the piercing flash of blue and red lights exploded in his rearview mirror, the sharp wail of a siren slicing through the calm. Eric's brows knit together as he guided the car to the side of the road and lowered his window. Behind him, the police cruiser stopped and the door swung open. Out stepped Officer Bradley Larson, mid-30s, hair cropped close, a badge gleaming on his chest. He adjusted his belt as he approached, carrying himself with the practiced confidence of a man used to controlling every encounter. "License and registration," he said flatly, his tone edged with authority. Eric moved calmly, retrieving the documents from his glove compartment and handing them over without a word. He could feel Larson's eyes watching him intently, as though searching for something more than a traffic violation. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer asked, leaning closer. "I'm not entirely sure," Eric replied politely, his tone even. "You didn't come to a full stop at the light," Larson said. There was the faintest flicker of hesitation in his voice. Eric frowned, but nodded slightly. "I see, I thought I slowed down in time, but I understand." Larson lingered at the window, narrowing his eyes as though the stop itself had become secondary. It was no longer about the light. Glancing at the license in his hand, he asked, "You're not from around here, are you?" "I moved here a few months ago," Eric said calmly. "The address is on the license." But Larson wasn't listening. His questions carried a sharper edge now, probing for something undefined. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" "Just going home," Eric answered, steady as ever. But beneath the calm, both men could feel the air shift. Larson's suspicion deepened, though nothing in Eric's demeanor invited it. Larson folded the documents slowly, tucking them into his chest pocket with deliberate care. Then, with a faintly smug expression, he ordered, "Step out of the car." Eric's hands tightened briefly on the wheel before he exhaled and complied. He stepped out, taller than the officer, his broad shoulders filling out his tailored suit. His polished shoes suggested precision, professionalism, someone meticulous and careful. Yet none of it seemed to matter. Larson gestured toward the front of the car. "Hands where I can see them." Eric obeyed, calm as ever. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" "Just routine," Larson said with a faint smirk. "We've had some incidents around here, you can never be too careful." Eric turned his head slightly, meeting the officer's eyes. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans? Or does this have more to do with something else?" The question landed hard. Larson's composure slipped, and his hand brushed instinctively toward his belt before he caught himself. "Watch your tone." "I'm simply asking," Eric said evenly. His words carried no defiance, only quiet firmness. Larson paced in front of the car, boots crunching against the asphalt. The balance of power in the stop was shifting, and he felt it. Most people would fidget, stammer, or wilt under pressure. But Eric's stillness, his composure, was unnerving. "You seem pretty confident," Larson muttered almost to himself. "Like you think you know what's going to happen next." "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer," Eric replied, softly. "Respect is." Larson froze. Something sharp flickered in his eyes, but words didn't come. The silence stretched between them like a live wire, both men aware of its weight. Larson tapped his fingers against his holster, his frustration simmering. He wasn't used to being challenged like this. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," he ordered. "I need to check for weapons." Eric raised an eyebrow. "Weapons? Do I look like someone carrying a weapon?" Larson's jaw clenched. "I'm not going to ask again." Without protest, Eric turned and set his palms against the hood, Larson's boots crunched closer as he began the search, his hands rough, lingering longer than necessary. It was less about safety and more about power, a way to provoke. But Eric didn't react. He neither flinched nor stiffened, standing with an unshakable calm. "You're clean," Larson muttered, irritation threading his voice. It sounded almost like defeat. Eric turned to face him, expression still neutral but eyes sharp. "Of course I am. Now, officer, if you're done." "I'm not done," Larson snapped, cutting him off. His voice rose, too quick, too defensive. "You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do. Care to explain why?" "I've had my fair share of interactions with law enforcement," Eric said, folding his arms casually. "Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years." "So what, you a lawyer or something?" Larson asked, suspicion flaring. Eric allowed himself the faintest smile. "Or something." The ambiguity stung. Larson stepped closer, lowering his voice to a near growl. "You think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this?" Eric didn't move. He held Larson's gaze, unwavering. "I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness. And so far I'm not seeing much of it here." The word struck like a challenge. Larson bristled, unable to resist. "Fairness? You think fairness is what this is about? People like you always—" He stopped abruptly, the rest of the sentence caught in his throat. Eric tilted his head slightly. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. "People like me?" Larson stiffened, the line he'd almost crossed hanging thick in the air. "You know what I mean," he muttered weakly, though the conviction had drained from his voice. Eric didn't flinch. His calm presence, his unshaken control, unsettled the officer more than resistance ever could. What had begun as a routine traffic stop was no longer about a red light or a citation. It had become something deeper, a test neither man had expected, and one that would define both of their futures. Eric Porter's calmness wasn't passive anymore. It was sharp, deliberate, a blade that cut through every pretense. "I think I do," he said quietly, his voice steady. "And I think we both know this stopped being about a traffic violation a long time ago." Officer Bradley Larson opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came. For the first time in the encounter, he looked uncertain, unsure of what to do. The balance of power was shifting, and the ground under his feet felt unsteady. Eric let the silence hold for a moment before breaking it. "Officer," he said, his words clear and unyielding, "I think it's time you know who I am." Larson's brows drew together, irritation flaring as he snapped back. "I don't care who you are," but his tone betrayed him. There was a crack in it now, a hint of unease. Eric moved slowly, deliberately reaching into his pocket. "I'm reaching for my badge," he said, watching Larson's hand twitch instinctively toward his holster. "No need for theatrics. I want you to see it." He pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open, the polished metal badge gleaming in the fading light. "Eric Porter," he said with a quiet finality. "Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division." Larson froze. His eyes darted between the badge and Eric's face, searching for a trick, a joke, anything that might undo the weight of what he was seeing. But there was no humor in Eric's expression, only authority and a tinge of disappointment. "Internal Affairs," Larson muttered, his voice cracking. "Yes," Eric cut in, sparing him the fumbling. "I oversee officer conduct. My job is to ensure that this badge," he tapped the emblem with a finger, "represents integrity, not abuse." Larson's face paled. His confident exterior unraveled, his hand falling from his belt as if it had become too heavy to bear. Eric stepped closer, forcing Larson to hold his gaze. "Do you know what the most troubling part of this interaction has been?" Eric asked softly. Larson said nothing. He looked like a man who had stepped into quicksand without realizing it until too late. "It's not the profiling," Eric continued, his voice like a scalpel. "Though that's bad enough, it's not the baseless escalation either. It's the fact that you've done all of this without realizing who you were talking to, You assumed I wouldn't know my rights, that I wouldn't understand the laws you swore to uphold, and why. Larson swallowed, but no words came. Because I didn't fit your idea of someone deserving respect, Eric finished for him. His words weren't angry, but they landed with the weight of an indictment. And that's not just a problem for me, officer. That's a problem for every single person you encounter in uniform. Larson's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. He looked again at the badge in Eric's hand as if wishing it would disappear. But it didn't. Eric gave him space, stepping back, though his voice stayed firm. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to step back, return my documents, and think very carefully about what you say next. Because the next time you hear from me, it won't be as a driver on the side of the road. It'll be as the man who decides whether you're fit to wear that badge at all. Larson's face flushed red. He reached into his chest pocket with trembling fingers, pulled out Eric's license and registration and handed them over. Eric tucked them into his wallet and walked back toward his car. At the door, he paused, glancing over his shoulder one last time. Remember this, Officer Larson. The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone. Eric slid into his sedan, started the engine, and drove away, leaving Larson standing in the fading light, his future suddenly uncertain. But for Eric, the encounter wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds of Eric's office at the Sacramento Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. On his desk sat an open file, Officer Bradley Larson. His record wasn't clean, small complaints of unprofessional conduct, vague notes about questionable stops, red flags that had been quietly filed away. Eric steepled his fingers, considering the broader picture. Larson wasn't an isolated problem. He was a symptom of something deeper. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant, Linda, stepped in with a stack of reports. Morning, Mr. Porter. Here's the misconduct summary from last month, and Chief Daniels asked me to remind you about next week's department review. Eric nodded, taking the files. Thanks, Linda. Can you also schedule a meeting with the chief for this afternoon? There's something I need to discuss. She caught the weight in his tone and hesitated. Of course, she said, then slipped out. Later that day, Eric sat across from Chief Daniels in a conference room. Daniels, a seasoned veteran with salt and pepper hair, leaned back as Eric recounted the traffic stop. I could have dismissed it as just another bad encounter, Eric said, his voice even. But that would have been a mistake. Larson's behavior isn't isolated. It reflects how much work we still have to do. Daniels exhaled, rubbing his temples. This isn't the first time his name's come up, but we've always handled it internally quietly. And that's the problem, Eric replied. Quiet fixes nothing. Quiet lets it happen again. It's time to be loud. Daniels studied him. What are you proposing? A department-wide review, Eric said without hesitation. Not just of officers, but of our training, our protocols, our accountability. If we don't hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can the public trust us? Daniels leaned forward, hands clasped. You're going to ruffle feathers. Good, Eric said simply. It's about time. In the weeks that followed, Eric worked tirelessly. He compiled data, interviewed officers, held community forums. The Larson incident became a spark for change. For Larson himself, an internal hearing was called. Eric sat across from him, his presence a silent reminder of the night on the roadside. Larson squirmed as his actions were laid bare, his confident facade gone. The hearing ended in suspension, but Eric knew the real victory wasn't punishing Larson. It was preventing the next Larson. Months later, Eric stood at a podium in front of officers, city leaders, and local residents. His words carried beyond the walls of the hall. He didn't talk about blame. He talked about responsibility, about the duty to ensure the badge stood for fairness, integrity, and respect. Justice isn't just about catching criminals, he said. It's about making sure those sworn to protect do so with honor. That's the badge I believe in, and that's the badge we're building together." The room erupted in applause, but Eric didn't dwell on it. He knew change wouldn't happen overnight, but it had begun. And as he stepped down from the podium, looking at the mix of skeptical and hopeful faces, he knew that was enough, for now.